In Oxford, England, winter of 1941, a woman walks down the silent street. Her steps are measured, calculated. Beneath her dark coat, a homemade radio transmitter weighs against her ribs. England lives in fear of Nazi bombing raids. But the danger she carries doesn't come from the sky. It comes from the coded information she is about to send to Moscow. Secrets about humanity's most secret project, the atomic bomb. Her name is Ruth Werner, but that's not her real name. In reality, she is Ursula Kuczynski, born in Berlin in 1907, the daughter of a Jewish family of progressive intellectuals. And at this moment she is the most important Soviet agent on British soil. The world is split in two. On one side, the Western democracies led by the United States and Great Britain. On the other, Stalin's Soviet Union. Between them, a distrust that will survive even the war against Hitler. It is the beginning of the Cold War. A conflict fought not with tanks and planes, but with secrets, lies, and invisible agents like Ruth. Ursula wasn't born a spy. She was born curious. She grew up in a vibrant Berlin of the 1920s, where cafes overflowed with debates about communism, fascism, and the future of Europe. Her father, Robert René Kuczynski, was a respected economist and statistician, a member of the German Communist Party. The Kuczynski home was a hall of ideas. Marx, Engels, Lenin were discussed at the dinner table as if debating the menu. At 18, Ursula was a young idealist, convinced that communism was the answer to the injustices she saw around her. Germany was bleeding under the weight of reparations from the First World War. Poverty was endemic. Unemployment was brutal. And in the streets, a man named Adolf Hitler was beginning to shout his promises of national rebirth. In 1929, Ursula married Rudolf Hamburger, a communist architect, and together they left for China. She, only 22 years old, he, on a secret mission for the Communist International, the organization that coordinated communist parties around the world. Shanghai, at the time, was a city torn apart by civil war between nationalists and communists. There, amidst the chaos, Ursula had her first real contact with the world of espionage. It was there, in a violent and divided Shanghai, that a man approached her. His name was Richard Sorge, a legendary Soviet spy who would later infiltrate Japan and transmit crucial information to Moscow during World War II. Sorge saw something rare in Ursula: sharp intelligence, unwavering ideological dedication, and the courage to live a double life. "You can do more for the cause than just hand out pamphlets," he said. "You can change the course of history." And so, in 1930, Ursula Kuczynski became an agent of the GRU, the Soviet Military Intelligence Directorate, one of the most feared espionage organizations in the world. Her codename, Sonia. The internal conflict was already planted. Ursula genuinely believed she was fighting for a better world, a world without exploiters and exploited. But the price was high: lying every day, living under false identities, abandoning the right to be herself, and yet she accepted. Because at that moment in history, for Ursula, the cause was worth any sacrifice. She didn't know that, a decade later, she would be transmitting the secrets of the atomic bomb from the heart of England to the Kremlin. She didn't know she would be responsible for one of the greatest espionage operations of the 20th century. She didn't know her life would become a deadly game where one mistake would mean execution, not just for her, but for everyone around her. This is the story of Ruth Werner, an ordinary woman who became an invisible weapon in the most silent war in history. A mother, a spy, a traitor, or a heroine, depending on who tells the story. And it all started with a choice: believing that the ends justify the means, even when the means destroy lives. Enter 1930 and 1933 in China during Civil War. The training of a spy doesn't happen in secret academies or underground bunkers. It happens in real life, under pressure, where mistakes cost lives. It was there that Ursula Kuczynski learned the rules of the game from Richard Sorge, the legendary Soviet spy. Never fully trust anyone, never leave a trace, never hesitate. She began with simple tasks: observing, taking notes, reporting, identifying contacts, mapping escape routes, memorizing faces. But soon Sorge realized that Ursula had a special talent. She was invisible. No one suspected a young European mother living in the Shanghai International Concession. In the eyes of the world, she was just another expatriate dealing with life in the East. Behind the facade, Ursula operated networks of informants, collected documents, and coordinated operations. She learned to use encrypted codes, invisible inks, and secret meeting points. She learned to detect surveillance, that overly persistent gaze, that same man on the corner twice in a row. She learned to disappear. In 1933, the Nazis came to power in Germany. The Kuczynski family was forced into exile. Ursula's decision solidified. She would never go back on it. Hitler represented everything she hated: fanatical nationalism, racism, brutality. For her, fighting for the Soviet Union was fighting against fascism. It was a just war, but the personal cost was mounting. Her marriage to Rudolf was crumbling. He knew about her double life, and he couldn't stand it. Ursula had chosen the mission. She would always choose the mission. GRU transfers her to Poland, then to Switzerland. In Geneva, she operates under the cover of a writer and translator. There she meets Alexander Foote, a British communist who would become one of her radio operators. And there, too, she masters the most crucial skill of a spy: radio transmission. Radio transmitters were the backbone of Soviet espionage. They allowed lone agents to communicate directly with Moscow, without intermediaries. But operating a transmitter was dangerous. The signals could be traced. The Nazis and the British had entire teams dedicated to hunting down clandestine transmitters, counter-espionage units equipped with radio frequency detectors that swept through cities looking for suspicious signals. Ursula learned to build transmitters from scratch, to encode messages in complex ciphers, and to transmit quickly, because every second on the air was another second of risk. She memorized schedules, frequencies, and emergency protocols. If something went wrong, she would have to destroy the equipment and disappear within minutes. But there was an emotional price. Ursula had 3 children during those years: Mika, Janina, and Peter. She loved them deeply, but she also knew that her double life put them in constant danger. She couldn't be an ordinary mother. I couldn't tell them bedtime stories without thinking about the codes I needed to transmit. I couldn't hug them without feeling the weight of the transmitter hidden in the closet. You can't have it both ways, a GRU officer once told her. Either you're a mother or you're an agent. I am both, Ursula replied, and she believed it. But deep down, she knew she was lying to herself. In 1938, things became too dangerous in Switzerland. World War II was about to break out. Moscow needed her somewhere else, a strategic location, a place where she could have the greatest possible impact. The order came: go to England. Ursula left with her children and a new identity: Ruth Werner, a German refugee fleeing Nazism. England welcomed her with open arms. After all, she was a victim of Hitler, not a threat. The British authorities had no idea who had really just entered the country. And that is how Sonia, the spy, transformed into Ruth Werner, the invisible woman who would transmit the secrets of the atomic bomb to Stalin. In Kidlington, on the outskirts of Oxford, between 1941 and 1945, Ruth Werner rented a discreet house, surrounded by gardens and seemingly tranquil. At night, when her children were asleep, she would go up to the attic to operate the radio transmitter that connected her directly to Moscow. Each coded message that came from there carried secrets that could change the course of the war and the world. There, in the attic, Ruth set up her radio transmitter. Every night after the children were asleep, she would go upstairs, adjust the frequencies, and send coded messages to Moscow. Each transmission lasted only a few minutes, long enough to transmit, but not to be tracked. She knew that MI5, the British counterintelligence service, constantly monitored radio waves. One slip, and she would be discovered. But Ruth wasn't there just to relay messages. She had a far more important mission: to coordinate a network of spies who were about to deliver the most valuable secret of the war to the Soviet Union. The Manhattan Project, the code name for the secret American-British program that would develop the first atomic bomb, was already underway. Brilliant physicists from around the world were working frantically to master nuclear fission before Hitler did. It was a scientific, military, and existential race. Whoever got there first would dominate the post-war world. But Stalin wasn't in the game. The Soviet Union, officially allied with the British and Americans against Hitler, was kept in the dark. Churchill and Roosevelt didn't trust Stalin. They wouldn't share the secret of the bomb. Moscow wouldn't accept that. And that's where Ruth Werner came in. His main contact was a British physicist named Klaus Fuchs, a naturalized German, a refugee from Nazism, a staunch communist, and one of the most talented scientists on the Manhattan Project. Fuchs worked in Birmingham at Tube Alloys, the British code name for the development of the atomic bomb. He had access to crucial information: critical mass calculations, detonator designs, uranium enrichment analyses, and he decided to pass them on to the Soviets. Fuchs and Ruth met in discreet locations: a country road, a quiet park, a busy cafe where no one would pay attention to two strangers talking. He delivered documents. She photographed them, encoded them, and transmitted them to Moscow. Sometimes the papers came folded in magazines, other times in ordinary envelopes. Nothing that would attract attention. "Why do you do that?" Ruth asked once. Fuchs stared at her with the cold calm of a scientist. "Because no country should have a monopoly on total destruction. If only the Americans have the bomb, they will dominate the world. There needs to be a balance." Ruth agreed. But he also knew that the balance Fuchs sought meant giving Stalin the ability to annihilate entire cities. She wouldn't let that idea disturb her. She couldn't. "Because if I started to doubt, everything would fall apart." The information Ruth transmitted was invaluable: nuclear reactor designs, plutonium production estimates, details about the assembly of the bomb. All of this crossed Europe on encrypted radio waves and reached Soviet scientists who used the data to accelerate their own nuclear program. Without Klaus Fuchs and Ruth Werner, the Soviet atomic project would have taken years longer. But with them, Stalin would detonate his first bomb in 1949, much sooner than the West had imagined possible. But operating at that level of risk took a brutal psychological toll. Ruth lived in a constant state of alert. Every knock on the door could be MI5. Every strange look on the street could be an undercover agent. Every transmission could be her last. She wasn't sleeping well. She didn't trust anyone outside the network. And she couldn't tell her children what she was really doing. They thought their mother was a writer. They didn't know she was helping to shape the planet's nuclear balance. There were times when Ruth almost got caught. Once neighbors commented on strange noises coming from her house at night. Ruth improvised, saying she listened to BBC radio to improve her English. Another time, a police officer knocked on the door asking about an illegal transmitter detected in the area. Ruth, with the calm that only years of training provide, said she knew nothing about it and offered tea. The officer left. She was too good, too invisible, and that saved her. In 1945, the war ends. American atomic bombs destroy Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The world discovers, horrified, the power of nuclear fission, and Joseph Stalin knows exactly what he needs to do: build his own bomb as quickly as possible. Ruth Werner continues broadcasting, but she feels the net closing in. MI5 is becoming more aggressive. The Cold War is beginning. And soon, very soon, Klaus Fuchs will be discovered. It's only a matter of time. In 1950, in post-war England, Ruth Werner's world begins to crumble. Klaus Fuchs is arrested, and his confessions expose the Soviet spy network operating at the heart of British science. Reading the headlines in the newspapers, Ruth understands that the time has come to disappear, before MI5 comes to her door. She learned of the arrest from the newspapers. The news exploded in the British press. British nuclear scientist confesses to spying for the Soviets. The scandal was devastating. Fuchs was sentenced to 14 years in prison. Anti-communist paranoia swept through England and the United States. The witch hunt was beginning. Ruth knew it was only a matter of time before MI5 came knocking on her door. She had two options: wait for arrest or flee. There was no third choice. But fleeing meant abandoning the life she had built in England. It meant tearing her children away from school, from their friends, from stability. It meant returning to a Germany divided, occupied, and devastated by war. And worse, it meant returning to East Germany, under Soviet control, under the shadow of Stalin's regime. She had no choice. Ruth began preparations with the same professional coldness she used in operations. She destroyed all incriminating documents. She dismantled the transmitter and buried the parts in different locations. She erased traces, burned letters, cut off contacts. She transformed herself once again into another person. In 1950, Ruth Werner and her children left England quietly. There were no dramatic farewells. There were no cinematic chases. She simply departed, like a shadow that disappears at dawn. They crossed the border into East Germany. Berlin was divided. The city Ursula had known in her youth no longer existed. In its place were rubble, fields of ruins, and an ideological wall that would soon become physical. In East Germany, Ruth was received as a heroine. The Stasi, the East German secret police, and the Soviet KGB knew exactly who she was. Ursula Kuczynski, codename Sonia, one of the most successful agents in the history of Soviet espionage. She had delivered the secrets of the atomic bomb. She had changed the global balance of power. She deserved recognition. But recognition came at a price. In East Germany, Ruth lived under constant surveillance, not from enemy intelligence, but from her own. The communist regime trusted no one, not even its heroes. She was monitored, controlled, constantly reminded that her loyalty was expected, not celebrated. The children grew up in a gray, authoritarian, suffocating country. They didn't understand why their mother had brought them there. They didn't understand why they couldn't go back to England, to the life they had. Ruth couldn't explain it. Not completely. "One day you'll understand," she would say, but she herself doubted it. The international impact of Klaus Fuchs's arrest was seismic. In the United States, the case fueled McCarthyist paranoia, the relentless persecution of real or imagined communists. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, an American couple accused of atomic espionage, were executed in the electric chair in 1953. The fear of Soviet infiltration became mass hysteria. In Britain, MI5 faced devastating criticism. How had a Soviet spy managed to operate freely on British soil for so long? How had the intelligence services failed to detect him? Heads rolled. Protocols were revised. Trust in the system crumbled. And Ruth Werner, the woman at the center of it all, was far away, protected behind the Iron Curtain. She was never tried. She never faced a British court. She never heard the verdict that would surely come: treason, death penalty, or life imprisonment. But she was never free either. In the following years, Ruth lived a quiet and controlled life in East Germany. She wrote her memoirs, worked as an editor, and raised her children. But the shadow of espionage never left her. She knew she had sacrificed everything: her freedom, her identity, her peace of mind, in the name of a cause that, little by little, she was beginning to question. Stalin died in 1953. The crimes of the Soviet regime began to come to light. The purges, the gulags, the mass executions. Ursula Kuczynski, who had once believed she was fighting for a better world, realized that she had served a machine of repression as brutal as the one she was fighting against. But it was too late to turn back, too late to undo the choices, too late to recover the lost years. She had changed the course of history, but the price was her own life. Decades later, in East Berlin between 1977 and 2000, Ursula Kuczynski decides to tell her story. She publishes her memoirs under the title Sonia's Report, and she transforms her own life into a testimony. In the West, she is called a traitor. In the East, celebrated as a heroine. But for her, writing is simply a way of trying to understand the price of her choices. The book caused a sensation. In the West, it was seen as the confession of a traitor. In East Germany, it was celebrated as the testimony of a heroine. But for Ursula, the book was something else entirely. An attempt to make sense of a life she herself no longer fully understood. She didn't regret the choices she had made, but she didn't glorify them either. "I did what I thought was right at the time," she said in an interview. "Would I do it again? I don't know. The world has changed. I've changed." In the following years, Ursula received honors from the East German government. She was decorated, praised, and transformed into a symbol of the anti-fascist struggle and socialist loyalty. But she knew these honors were empty. The regime that celebrated her was the same one that watched her every move. The socialism she had defended had become a bureaucratic and oppressive dictatorship. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. East Germany collapsed. The Soviet Union crumbled 2 years later. And with it, the world that Ursula had helped to build vanished. She lived to see the end of the Cold War. She lived to see the KGB and Stasi files opened, the crimes exposed, the victims identified. She lived to see history rewritten, and her name appear as a footnote in books about nuclear espionage. Ursula Kuczynski died in 2000, at the age of 93 in Berlin. Her death was reported discreetly. There was no state funeral. There were no public tributes. She was buried like an ordinary woman, alongside an extraordinary life that few truly understood. Today, Ruth Werner's legacy is complex and controversial. To some, she is a traitor, a woman who sold the secrets of her adopted country to a foreign dictatorship. jeopardizing the safety of millions. To others, she is an idealist, a woman who genuinely believed she was fighting against fascism and for a more just world, even if her actions served a brutal regime. For historians, she is a fascinating enigma. Ursula was undoubtedly one of the most effective spies of the 20th century. She operated for over a decade undetected. She transmitted information that accelerated the Soviet nuclear program by years. She changed the strategic balance of the Cold War. And yet, she remains relatively unknown. There are no Hollywood movies about her. There are no monuments. Her name is not pronounced with the same reverence or hatred reserved for other famous spies like Kim Philby or Aldrich Ames. Perhaps because Ursula's story doesn't fit into simple narratives. She wasn't purely a villain nor purely a heroine. She was a woman who made impossible choices in impossible times, who sacrificed everything: freedom, identity, peace, for a cause that ultimately betrayed her own hopes. The Soviet atomic bomb detonated in 1949 was a direct result of the information transmitted by Ursula and Klaus Fuchs. This bomb changed the world. It created the balance of nuclear terror that defined the Cold War. It perhaps prevented a Third World War, because no power would dare attack another knowing that the retaliation would be apocalyptic. But that same bomb also trapped humanity in an existential dilemma that persists to this day. The threat of total annihilation hangs over our heads like a sword of Damocles, and Ursula Kuczynski helped put it there. What does this story teach us? It teaches that courage is not always virtuous, that loyalty can be blind, that ideological certainty can transform us into instruments of forces we do not fully understand. It teaches that the heroes of one story are the villains of another, and that the truth, in the end, is almost always more ambiguous than we would like to admit. Ursula Kuczynski lived many lives. She was a mother, a spy, a writer, a refugee, a heroine, a traitor. But above all, she was a woman who believed, deeply dangerously, that her actions could change the world. And she was right. But the question remains, was it for the best? The answer depends on who you ask. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. In history, there are no simple answers, only choices and consequences. Ruth Werner made her choices, and the world to this day lives with the consequences.